Have you ever driven down a deserted highway at night, where the darkness feels alive and something unseen lurks just beyond your headlights? Out here, you're not alone. Something is watching, waiting. It was a crisp autumn night in late October 2024, when I found myself driving along Route 9 near Sleepy Hollow, New York, a road infamous for its haunted history. The legend of the Headless Horseman loomed large, but I had always been skeptical of such tales. The air was cool, with temperatures hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, and the road was eerily quiet, with only the rhythmic hum of my engine breaking the silence. As I navigated a particularly dark stretch, my headlights caught a figure standing by the roadside. A woman in a vintage dress, her thumb outstretched in a plea for a ride. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. She slid into the back seat without a word, her presence sending a chill down my spine. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "Just a bit further up the road," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. We drove in silence, the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing mile. I stole a glance at her through the rearview mirror, noting her pale complexion and distant gaze. Something about her seemed off. As we approached the old Dutch church of Sleepy Hollow, she suddenly spoke. "You can let me out here." I pulled over and she stepped out, pausing to look back at me. "Thank you," she murmured before disappearing into the darkness. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow her. But as I rounded the corner, she was nowhere to be seen. The churchyard was empty, save for the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Uneasy, I returned to my car and continued my journey. The next day, I recounted the experience to a local friend. His face grew pale. "You're not the first to pick up a woman like that on Route 9, he said gravely. "Legend has it she's the spirit of a young woman who died near the old Dutch church decades ago. She appears to drivers seeking a ride home, but vanishes before she gets there." I laughed it off, attributing the encounter to an overactive imagination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come face to face with one of Sleepy Hollow's restless spirits. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I found myself driving down an empty stretch of highway in rural Pennsylvania. I had been on the road for hours, heading back home after visiting my parents. The highway was eerily silent, with no other cars in sight. My only company was the occasional green mile marker and the steady hum of my tires against the asphalt. Thick trees lined both sides of the road, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the moonlight. A dense fog had begun rolling in, clinging to the pavement and making it harder to see. The glow of my headlights barely cut through the murky haze, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, focusing on the road ahead. That's when I saw him. A man crouched in the ditch on the right side of the road. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, and he wasn't wearing any shoes. His head hung low, his face obscured by long, greasy hair. He looked like he had been in an accident, or worse. Instinctively, I slowed down. Something inside me told me to keep driving, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But what if he needed help? Maybe his car had broken down, or maybe he had been attacked. I hesitated, debating whether to stop. Then he moved. In one swift motion, he turned his head to face me. Even through the fog, I could see his eyes, black, hollow, and void of life. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. He didn't look human. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my foot on the gas. My tires screeched as my car sped forward. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me. But the ditch was empty. I didn't stop until I reached the next gas station, my hands trembling as I clutched the steering wheel. The attendant inside must have noticed how pale I looked, because he asked if I was okay. "I saw someone on the road," I stammered. "In the ditch just a few miles back." His face darkened. "You were on a Highway 41, weren't you?" I nodded. "You're not the first," he said grimly. "People have been seeing that man for years. He only appears in the fog. They say he was a hitchhiker who got hit by a truck back in the 70s, but his body was never found." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't sleep that night, and to this day I avoid driving alone on Highway 41, especially when there's fog. It was a little past midnight when I found myself driving down a long, desolate road in Arizona, cutting through the desert like a black ribbon under the moonlight. I had just left a friend's house in a small town and had at least 2 hours of highway ahead of me before I reached my motel. The air was still, the landscape vast and empty. The only light came from my headlights, illuminating the cracked pavement ahead and the occasional green glow of mile markers. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just endless stretches of desert on either side, dotted with towering cacti and scattered boulders. I was about 20 miles from the nearest gas station when I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared far behind me. I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes, but now suddenly, this one was there. Its lights were unnervingly bright, almost too bright, as if the driver had their high beams on. I kept my eyes on the road, assuming they'd pass me soon. But they didn't. Instead, the car stayed exactly the same distance behind me, matching my speed perfectly. If I slowed down, it slowed down. If I sped up, so did it. A creeping unease settled in my stomach. I tried to convince myself it was just some other late-night traveler, but something about the way they followed me, never getting closer, never falling back, made my skin crawl. Then just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. I blinked, my heart pounding. One moment, the headlights were in my mirror. The next, the road behind me was empty. No sign of taillights fading into the distance. No turnoffs, no exits. Just an endless stretch of asphalt. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. Had I imagined it? I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the growing sense of dread that crawled up my spine. But before I could process what had just happened, something even worse occurred. A cold chill filled the car, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. The air had been warm just seconds ago, but now it was freezing. My windshield began to fog up slightly, despite the dry desert air outside. And then, a sound, a whisper, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, coming from the back seat. I didn't turn around. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to look. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I focused on the road, forcing myself to keep driving. My pulse thundered in my ears. The whispering grew louder, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping in an eerie, incomprehensible murmur. And then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The temperature returned to normal. The whispering vanished. My windshield cleared. I finally dared a glance in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The back seat was empty. I didn't stop until I reached my motel. I practically ran to my room, locking the door behind me and double-checking the windows. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I told a local about what happened. His face turned serious. "You saw it," he said quietly. "Saw what?" I asked. "The Phantom car. People have reported it for years. A vehicle that appears out of nowhere, follows you, then vanishes. Some say it's a ghostly traveler who died on that road decades ago. Others believe it's something worse, something that watches, that chooses who sees it. I never drove that road at night again, and to this day I wonder, if I had looked back into the back seat that night, what would I have seen?"